Oh, good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in and joining in our Connie and Lind webinar. It's a webinar specifically for Queensland member churches. My name is Heilala Tambete. I'm the Director for Client Engagement and Business Development, bit of a mouthful, and I'm pleased to host today's webinar with Eustacia Yates, our Special Counsel, who will be talking about domestic violence and ministry implications. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. At any stage, you can send through your questions in the chat section. Actually, we've actually got quite a few. Or there could be a questions button accessible to you. Send that through. We'll see them. Eustacia may answer them straight away, or alternatively, she might leave it till the end of a section to address it fully. Can I just confirm that you can all hear by replying through on the chat to say yes? Hello, can you all hear me clearly? If you could just reply in your chat box to say yes, that would be great. Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Joshua. So yeah, to get us started, I'll just give you a bit of information about Eustacia. Eustacia is our family law team leader. She may not be a stranger to a few of you, having previously worked with Malian College. She has worked in a number of private firms committed to serving family law clients, and has a broad range of experience in both parenting, property matters, as well as domestic violence. I think this is a particular area that she shares a special passion in, and I will hand over to her now to take you through the webinar. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for listening and joining us for this webinar. I'm very privileged and pleased to be able to present it to you. It is an area of practice that is important to me, and important to me both as a lawyer and as a Christian. I do have theological training, have a degree from Malian College, and so I am both a theologically trained person as well as a legal practitioner in the area of family law. For me, it's about his kingdom come. And to my way of thinking, there's no domestic violence in heaven. So how do we bring the kingdom here on earth? I'm just going to start scrolling through the slides now. I'm not sure how many of you will be familiar with Corney and Lind, but just by way of a brief introduction, we're a mid-sized law firm of around 18 lawyers. I think that's just been bumped up to 19 last week, and 30-odd support staff. We practice in a range of areas, and we travel should you require it. There's just some information there about my personal experience, degree in law, degree in arts, graduate diploma in divinity. I wish it was as simple as doing a degree in order to be divine. I think the most important thing on that slide is I have heard most of it, and not much shocks me anymore. The plan for today, we're going to run through a number of questions and concepts. This is where we're headed, recognising abuse. What is domestic violence? I suspect most people think that they have a pretty good handle on what constitutes domestic violence, but I'm wondering whether some of you perhaps might be surprised as to what is included within the scope of that definition at law. Current statistics, understanding the effect of domestic violence, signs and symptoms, creating a safe environment, equipping people to recognise and respond, and shaping community attitudes. Now, it seems to me that pastors often will find themselves, or church workers will find themselves in a position where someone is making a disclosure about domestic violence, or perhaps you discover that that's occurring within your congregation. And at that point, you've entered the space between that disclosure or discovery and what you think is perhaps your ideal theological outcome. And in my experience, it seems to me that a lot of pastors treat this space here as something quite short. But in reality, it's actually a very long space. And there are lots of things that go into either making that journey a good experience for victims of domestic violence or a very damaging experience. Particularly for pastors, they will be influenced by things like their theological training, their beliefs, their family of origin, their culture, the advice that they've received during their lifetime, what denomination they are. And so all of those things factor into the advice that they give, how willing they are to get involved. And so what I really want to address today is this space in between. I imagine if you've been theologically trained as a pastor, you've got a fairly clear view about what you think about marriage or about family relationships, and that it is potentially quite a high view in the sense that marriages tend to be considered as something sacred and something of great value. And that's fine. My concern as a practitioner is that that space in between that ideal position and the reality of what people are experiencing can be quite big. And so I want to address what to do today in that space in between. Some possible scenarios, and these are all ones that have come up for people that I know. A member of the congregation discloses that they are a victim of the violence in their home, either during a counselling or a pastoral care meeting. What do you do? Where do you start? A member of the congregation comes to you and says that he can't have contact with his wife or children because of a domestic violence order, but he wants to take steps to open a dialogue and reconcile with his wife. Another possible scenario. A member of the congregation comes to you and says that they have decided to separate from their spouse. They disclose that they have engaged a lawyer and are seeking a DVO, a domestic violence order, against their spouse, but the spouse also attends the church. What's a pastor to do? Alternatively, you might interact with someone in the church family, and it might be a child as well as a couple, and think that, well, something's just a bit odd. First question to ask, I guess, is it domestic violence? Now, in terms of what constitutes domestic violence, we look primarily to the Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act, which is a Queensland Act. Other acts define it. Other acts will have quite a lot to say about violence in particular scenarios in the workplace or in certain care relationships, for example. But what we're focusing on today is domestic and family violence. So we look to the Queensland Act. Now, the Act says that, first of all, there has to be a relevant relationship between the person perpetrating the violence and the person who is experiencing that violence. And it might surprise you to learn that the relevant relationships are fairly broadly defined under the Act. It includes family relationships. So it could be, for example, a brother-sister, father-brother, mother-son, sister-sister, child-parent, aunt-nephew, or any other combination of family relationships, cousins, that sort of thing. I've just had a question pop up. Will there be a verbal presentation? Could you please, again, just confirm that you can, in fact, hear that I'm speaking by clicking or typing yes in the chat box, please? So I've had one person confirm that they can hear me. If you can hear me, would you please type the word yes into the chat box? Okay, so I have a couple of yeses. My administrator's just briefly left the room. When she returns, for those who haven't responded with a yes, I'll ask her to check on your links. Coming back to the slides, A relevant relationship can include an informal care relationship. For example, a paid or volunteer carer who comes into the home to provide care services. Sometimes people will say, oh, you know, so-and-so just comes around once a week to do something in the home. Sorry, I'm just getting some comments through the chat line there. I'm not sure that everyone can hear.
Can you, sorry, yep. Okay, so Linda, can you hear us? The other thing probably to say is just to broadband. Phil, thank you. I just spoke to you over the phone. I know you're connected. What I might do is, can everyone hear us now? Is this better sounding for everyone? Can you just reply into the chat box? Fantastic, thank you. All right. The other thing to say as well is that at the end of this presentation, the webinar will be made available along with the slides, and the link will be sent to QB. All right. Thank you, Stacey.
All right, so just picking up where we've left off, a relevant relationship obviously includes a spousal relationship or a de facto relationship. Under the legislation, it also includes an engaged couple who are, oh, sorry, I've got one person saying they can't hear. Shall I just press on?
Maybe all right, Linda, what I might do is I'll just can you just send through your phone details? I'll give you a call separately to see what I can do to help with that audio. And the same with you, look, Jen. If you could just send me through your phone details, I will have to. I'll see if I can call you now or email you the presentation with the audio.
Okay, moving on. A relevant relationship. So it also includes an engaged couple who are not living together and a couple who are simply in a couple relationship. They're dating, they don't live together, they're not engaged, they're not married. So as you can see, it's a very broad and inclusive range of relationships that will meet that criteria for being a relevant relationship. Once there has been a relevant relationship identified, the Act provides that domestic violence exists where one person engages in certain behaviour to the other person in that relationship. And not surprisingly, it includes things like physical violence or sexual abuse. It includes emotional or psychological abuse, economic abuse, threatening behaviour, coercive behaviour, which means they're compelling or forcing the other person to do or not do something, or really any behaviour that controls or dominates the other person, causing them to fear for their own safety or well-being, or the safety and well-being of someone else. Now, we will unpack these as we go, and you'll get some very specific examples of what each of these look like as we progress through the webinar today. These examples of domestic violence are set out in the Act. These are lifted straight from the Act itself. Causing personal injury, coercing the other person to engage in sexual activity or attempting to do so, depriving the other person of their liberty or threatening to do so. This one comes up a bit where there's a couple relationship and they're not engaged or anything, where they're travelling in a car and they might have an argument about something and she'll say, I want you to pull over, and he refuses to do so. That's a deprivation of liberty. Threatening the other person with death or injury to their child or someone else that they care about. Threatening to commit suicide or self-harm so as to torment, intimidate or frighten, or causing injury to an animal. It also includes unauthorised surveillance of the other person. For example, reading their text messages, monitoring their email account without their consent or their internet browser history, monitoring a person's account with a social networking site, using a GPS device to track a person's movements. You can't believe how often that one comes up for me in my work. Checking the recorded history in a person's GPS device and seeing whether perhaps the odometer reading on the car complies with time frames and things that the person has said that they've, or places that they've said they've been to. In addition, if someone in a relevant relationship gets another person to engage in any of the above behaviours, they themselves will have committed domestic violence. You can't, for example, get around the act by saying, oh, I'll ask someone else to check the email history. Current statistics, I think the serious state of affairs in Australia is very well documented. Probably everybody's aware of some of the more general community statistics around domestic violence and the prevalence of it in our community. So what I've tried to do, and I'm sorry that's a bit small, is find statistics in relation to the Australian Church. Now, there's actually very little Australian research on the nature and prevalence of domestic abuse in our church communities, and a lot of it is in fact dated. There has been a couple of key surveys and one analysis, and the findings are fairly interesting. They're not specifically in relation to Baptist communities, however they are Christian communities within Australia. At least 1 in 5 husbands who abuse Christian wives go to church regularly. There's quite a lot of material that I've put here, which I'm not going to speak to every slide because one of my goals in preparing this presentation was to provide you with some material that you can go back to later and some material that you can have as referral lists and things like that. But I think the main thing to take away is that the statistics show that abuse occurs to the same degree inside the church as outside. And I think that probably surprises a lot of people. I think there's probably an assumption that church attendance is somehow preventative, has a preventative effect, and that the rates within the church are perhaps lower than outside the church. We know that the rates of domestic violence are extremely high outside the church, so ergo, they're extremely high within the church. Understanding the effect of domestic violence. When a relationship comes to an end, particularly if it's been a long-term relationship and there are children involved, the practical arrangements are enormous, and it often surprises people the level of detail that they have to think about that they haven't had to think about before, even down to who puts money on the tuck shop account for school, quite apart from the big things like where am I going to live and how will I pay for food. So when a relationship comes to an end, obviously there's heightened emotions, there's grieving, there's an enormous number of practical arrangements that need to be made. We always say that it's good for people to get legal advice in the early stages, and I'm sure the skeptics out there are probably thinking we're spruiking for business, but in my experience, and particularly as a collaborative practitioner, in my experience, some early sensible advice can actually go a long way to really narrowing the issues that the parties are in dispute about, giving them a platform to understand their responsibilities as well as their rights. And it often gives them a framework for being able to have some conversations themselves and work things out to some extent. Now, obviously, that's more difficult in circumstances where there's been violence, but at least if someone has an awareness of what their entitlements are, then they have a way of navigating what is going to be a fairly difficult road. I think it's important to know that when there has been domestic violence in a relationship, a lot of domestic violence victims will leave and reconcile a number of times, and the statistics tell us that there's an average of 9 times before the final separation. There are a range of reasons for this, and I will speak to that as well a little bit later. But when someone finally is able to, it's really important that they have the support that they need. Leaving is the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence. Statistically, we know that's the case, as well as at around about the 12-month mark after separation. So it's important that they have that support during that the space in between, if you like, disclosure and ideal outcomes. And safety is obviously therefore incredibly important. If I can ask you to take anything away from today, please take away that it's important not to underestimate how much danger a woman leaving a DV situation is in. Obviously, the effects go far beyond the two people that are in the relationship. For the victim, death, illness, injury, disability, this comes up for me quite regularly in my work. People have ongoing, the legacy of ongoing injuries, particularly if there's been I'm sorry to be quite graphic, if there's been an attempt at strangulation. We call it a non-lethal strangulation, and it can have very serious implications for their health going forward. Emotional and psychological trauma has a devastating impact on individuals' physical, mental and emotional health. We know from the research now that that is equally difficult to overcome and equally damaging to a person than as compared to, say, the physical abuse that occurs. I still find women coming into my practice who will say, "Oh, but he didn't hit me," as if somehow this is the line in the sand about whether it is or is not violence. Quite clearly, we can see that the law itself puts them all in the same basket. And I think it's important that, as Christians, as pastors, and as members of the community, we live under the law and we accept that the research which tells us that it's equally devastating, even if what you've experienced is emotional and psychological abuse, that is equally devastating to experiencing physical abuse, or it can be. Homelessness is a growing issue. I've got New South Wales statistics simply because they were easier to come by, but I do know in Queensland that I think it's in the age group of 45 plus for women. They are the fastest growing homeless group, and largely it's down to related issues of domestic violence. Effects on the family goes without saying. Violence and the threat of violence at home creates fear, destroys family environments, leads to the breakup of families. We often see that there are involvement of external agencies to a fairly high level, either at the beginning or by the end of the process. Effects on the community more broadly. Children grow up without learning about positive and respectful relationships. Abusers going to prison, higher rates of alcohol and drug use, and all the associated costs that go with that are both economic and social. Whole slide on how children deal with it. This could almost be a presentation in itself, and I don't want to actually dwell on that too much now, given that the main thrust of the presentation today is about ministry resources. But I think it goes without saying that it has a devastating impact on all those who are either experiencing it directly or exposed to it. Signs and symptoms. As I was preparing this presentation, I spoke with a number of pastors and what would be helpful to them. And a number of them said to me, how do I know if it's happening? And hence the signs and symptoms. But there is no one simple answer. If you haven't got a disclosure and you're simply looking at circumstances, of course it can be difficult to identify. And not one symptom, if you like, or one sign is not necessarily going to tell you the whole story. However, if you see a chain of events or a regular occurrence of a particular issue, it might be worth starting a conversation. So the kinds of things that you might be noticing is that there's lots of jealousy in a relationship, or possessiveness, put downs, threats and violence you're unlikely to see directly. although that does happen as well. Unfairly, regularly accusing her of flirting or being unfaithful, controlling how she spends money. And this is, I understand that this can be difficult. There would be many couples who have complete visibility of their finances between each other, and there's not necessarily any sort of control that goes on there at all. It might, in fact, be quite a genuine pulling together, if you like, to achieve some common goals. But when it comes down to one person making all of the decisions in relation to money and the other person has no decision-making power or even influence, I think some questions can be asked at that point. Deciding what she wears or eats. It seems like such a strange thing to write down, that one, but actually that comes up quite a lot. Having a say about, not just a say, but a control over what she wears or eats. Humiliates or embarrasses her in front of other people. And I am assuming in this presentation that the perpetrator is male, just for the sake of being efficient. We know that statistically women are the victims of domestic violence in much greater numbers, to the tune of somewhere between, I think it's 85 and 90%. She doesn't spend much time with her friends and family anymore. That sort of sense of being isolated is a very common indicator that there's something going on. You may not see any threats or physical assaults. You may see evidence of that. You might see that stuff is often broken around their house, whether it was a window or plates or cups or things like that. If there's yelling or threats to use a weapon, and a weapon, of course, can be anything, constantly comparing her with other people, constantly criticising her intelligence, mental health, appearance, or preventing her from practicing her religion. Oh, so-and-so wouldn't be happy if I came to that. Or, no, you can never have home group at our house with all your religious friends, something along those lines. Other signs and symptoms: they've lost their confidence or unusually quiet. They seem to feel afraid of their partner. They might avoid certain topics. They might express that, perhaps in a joking way, that they can't seem to do anything right for their partner and they wonder if they're the one who is going crazy. They might talk about their partner being jealous or bad-tempered. I think it's important to know that most victims of domestic violence chronically undersell it. It's usually, if they do make a disclosure to you, you can almost be certain that it is significantly worse than what they're reporting. Sabotaging their job or their studies often presents as, oh, they always start a big fight with me the night before an exam, so I can't concentrate and do it. They will spoil special occasions like having a big fight with you on the night of your graduation, for example, or the night before you start a new job, things like that. And again, just be reminded that not any one of these is an indicator that domestic violence is occurring, but when you see a pattern, it's time to ask some questions. Withholding basic necessities comes up a lot too, particularly for medication, and taking scripts and medication should be part of any safety planning that gets done. Okay, so creating a safe environment. So when there's been disclosure or discovery that domestic violence is occurring in your church, you've entered what I call the space in between. And I think it's really important that pastors are educated around this issue, because they're uniquely positioned to do incredible good in that space, but also uniquely positioned to do incredible harm. And I think it's really unfortunate. I hear a lot of stories in my practice about people who've made disclosures to their pastors and were not met with what they needed at the time, and the ongoing consequences for them are very difficult. And so I guess I just put that in as something to think about, because I do think pastors have a unique role to play. So in order to assist you, I've created a bit of a list of do's and don'ts for creating a safe environment. The first and most important thing, if someone makes a disclosure to you, is to believe them. We know from the research and from the stats that the majority of those who do report experiencing domestic violence will only do so once. And for those who do report again, there's likely to be a very long time period between reports, and I'm talking years. Remember I said earlier that the average number of attempts to leave is 9. And so that time period between disclosing it to someone can be a significant length of time. Of course, we're always met with questions about, oh, but aren't they just making it up? Aren't they overstating it? The answer is simply no. Start to work and operate in this space for any length of time. And in fact, what we discover is that the opposite is true. It's massively underreported and under both in terms of the severity and also in terms of the number of times that it's occurring. So from best we can tell, statistically, false reporting saying that violence has occurred when it hasn't is believed to be around the 2% mark of those who report. So if I can encourage you to do anything, it's to believe them. It's not that I don't understand that people have perspectives around things, particularly some of the more subtle ways that one party will control the other. However, the best thing you can do is to believe what they're saying and reassure them that this is not their fault and that violence has no place in our churches. Next most important thing, safety first. Be practical, offer support. If you're equipped to do some safety planning or do a risk assessment, then do it. Key questions. Are you safe? Do you need a safe place to stay? Do you want me to come and collect you, the children, the dog? And pets are really important. I think a colleague of mine who's had about 15 years in domestic violence work was saying she's lost count of the number of times women particularly will struggle to leave a situation because they can't take their dog with them. Remembering, of course, that this dog is likely to have been a protector and a comfort to them during violent episodes in the past. You can be asking, do you have a plan to keep safe? How can I help? I know one lady who was desperate to leave, had done a little bit of reading online, was aware that it would be helpful when she decided to leave to have a bag packed or even just some documents stored at a friend's house, things like birth certificates and medical records and things like that, and asked a friend, could you hold these documents at your house? And was met with, no, that would make me uncomfortable. And then I think it took her about another 18 months to get up the courage to ask again. So safety first, and be practical about the support that's offered. It may be helpful to document your conversation after the fact. I don't want to dwell too much on that. But the third most important thing is to refer. It's a bit like the old 3 rules of real estate: location, location, location. The 3 rules of dealing with domestic violence victims: refer, refer, refer. It's a specialised area. I'm not suggesting that you abdicate any responsibility to provide care or support, but it is a fairly difficult to navigate, and it's a specialist area. So the best thing you can do is have a list of referral options on a sheet of paper tucked away that you can pull out as and when you need. I wouldn't suggest emailing it to them unless they have already said that that's okay, because a lot of the times the violence that's being perpetrated includes surveillance, and that email will be discovered and can potentially make things worse. So some of the external providers that might be involved: Department of Communities and Child Safety Services in Queensland. Their role is to protect children. They're often involved in partnership with the police. There's a range of providers listed there. I'll just draw your attention to the Magistrates Court of Queensland. They are the ones who will actually make domestic violence orders. they're largely called protection orders these days. And so if you have a referral list, it's probably good to just have tucked away the address of the magistrates court, your local magistrates court, and be able to say to a domestic violence victim, oh, are you getting a protection order? Do you know where to go to ask questions about how to do that? I've tried to put in quite a long list for you of service providers. The ones within asterisks are ones that I have personally had to do within my work and found them to be really helpful. The other ones have decent reputations, although I haven't dealt with them personally, which is why I've included them but not given them an asterisk. In particular, I draw your attention to the DV Connect Women's Line. It's a telephone hotline. Anyone can phone it, and they will actually give you information about shelters if women need emergency accommodation. So if you find that someone is asking you about, I need to get out of the house and where can I stay, and you're in a position where you're trying to assist them to find some emergency accommodation, that's the best place to start, is the DV Connect Women's Line. List of don'ts. Don't be neutral. People who make disclosures might hear things from pastors or pastoral care workers along the lines of, I'm not sure I should get involved, I don't want to take sides, we must be careful to love both of you. You know, I'm sure there's two sides to every story. When it comes to domestic violence, it's really unhelpful to take a neutral position. And what I've included there is a quote from a book written by Lundy Bancroft, which is the textbook that QUT uses for their graduate certificate in domestic violence. I'm just going to read it because I think it's quite powerful and makes the point. There's no point paraphrasing it. It's not possible to be truly balanced in one's views of an abuser and an abused woman. As Dr. Herman explains eloquently in her masterwork, Trauma and Recovery, neutrality actually serves the interests of the perpetrator much more than those of the victim and is not neutral. Although an abuser prefers to have you wholeheartedly on his side, he will settle contentedly for your decision to take a middle stance. To him, that means you don't see the couple's problems. That means you see the couple's problems as partly her fault and partly his fault, and that means it isn't abuse. So please, don't be neutral. I'm not saying to be naive and believe every word that comes out of every person's mouth, but where someone has made a disclosure, they need support, and so please don't be neutral. Please don't ignore their practical needs in favour of trying to achieve a desired theological outcome. I've inserted a verse there from James, which no doubt you're all familiar with, and I've imposed some of my own thoughts straight within the verse. So what good is it if someone claims to have faith, or, if you like, the best, most well thought out theological position on marriage, but has no deeds? Can such a faith save them? Suppose a sister is without clothes and daily food. And just to insert there, that's not unusual. People will often leave at short notice without an income, which means they literally don't have clothes or food. Suppose a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, or marriage is sacred, return and live in love with your husband, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself is not accompanied by action. If it is not accompanied by action, is dead. And this is why I say you may hold, and I respect this and I understand this, quite a high view of marriage, and that ultimately the goal could perhaps be reconciliation and the kind of covenantal relationship that most people would initially aspire to. However, the space in between disclosure and that ideal theological outcome is quite fraught, and there's no point in that space pointing people to that desired theological outcome and that's the only thing you do. If you cannot meet them on a practical level in that space in between, then there's no point holding that theological position on marriage. A few other don'ts. Don't be complicit in a criminal act. And this is something that pastors often unwittingly expose themselves to. A protection, or if a woman has a protection order against someone, that is not a criminal matter. That is a civil matter. Obtaining a protection order is a civil matter. But if her husband or partner or brother or whomever it is breaches the protection order, he's committed a criminal act. It's dealt with in a different jurisdiction. And pastors can sometimes unwittingly be pulled into that. They might meet with the husband who says, oh, there is a protection order. I'm just desperate to speak to her. I'm very sorry. I'm very remorseful. Do you think you could just talk to her and see if we can open a conversation? Now, the protection order will almost certainly say, and even if it doesn't, it's explicit in the Act, that they cannot ask other people to contact the aggrieved party. So the last thing pastors want to do is put themselves in a position where they are assisting someone to commit a criminal offence. I would suggest trying not to act as an intermediary. There is plenty of support that can be provided without playing that kind of intermediary role. I think you need to be very cautious about that. Please don't give legal advice, and that includes advising them to withdraw applications for protection orders or advising them to return home. It's outside, I guess, the scope of what's appropriate for a pastor to offer. And so I actually see it all the time, that women have been advised to withdraw their application, and it's actually very unhelpful in the situation. It erodes a lot of trust on both of the pastor themselves and of the church more generally. Another don't is, perhaps goes without saying, please don't judge or minimise. You won't know everything or even the worst of it. It is probably much worse than is being reported. And for every person who speaks up about it, there's at least one other person who doesn't speak up. We know that it's massively underreported. Equipping people to recognise and respond. And I think this is a really important one for pastors. If you're at all familiar with the cycle of violence, then none of this will come as a surprise to you. So we have the standard, say there's been a domestic violence explosion. So whether that is something that's quite obvious to the outside world and big, perhaps there's been a physical assault and someone's ended up in hospital, or it might be an economic thing where suddenly someone's been cut off from the joint bank accounts and they're left without money, but they only discover it at Coles when they've got a trolley full of food with their toddler, that they don't have access to money anymore. So there's some sort of an event. What follows is the remorse phase. And I think this is where a lot of people who aren't familiar with the cycle get tripped up. I'm sure most pastors and pastoral care workers have thought through the difference between remorse and repentance. And if not, then that's definitely worth turning your mind to. The remorse phase looks a lot like repentance. And this is often where pastors are called upon to act as a go-between or to offer support to both parties or to get involved, essentially. And so I just raise it as a note of caution because only time can really tell whether the remorse phase is in fact true repentance or not. I don't want to spend too much time going through it. I'm sure that there are some of you I can see on the list who will be better acquainted with this cycle than I am. Pursuit phase, honeymoon, build up, standover. This cycle can take weeks or months, or it can take a matter of days. And what we know is that the shorter time frame, the shorter time in which the couple goes through the cycle, the more likely the explosion is going to result in serious injury or death. Equipping people, beg your pardon, to recognise and respond. I think it's really helpful to challenge some of your own assumptions and views. The short answer, why don't they leave if it's so bad, in my view, is because it's harder to leave than it is to stay. And that should tell you something about how difficult it is to actually leave a violent situation. There are lots of reasons why people won't leave, and one of them will be because they don't see themselves that this is a cycle. They believe their remorseful partner that it won't in fact happen again. So perhaps they need to go through the cycle a few times before they appreciate that repentance, which means it's unlikely to happen again, has actually occurred. But there are a lot of reasons which makes it difficult for people to leave what can be very terrible situations. Not the least persuasive is that they're quite genuine in their faith, and they're quite wanting to do the right thing, and they believe the advice from their spiritual advisors. Fear of shame, fear of how the church family will react are very powerful constraints. Shaping church and community attitudes towards domestic violence. Does the church play a role? Look, the short answer is yes, whether you think it should or not. The question as to whether the church should play a role in shaping community attitudes is essentially a theological question. The reality is the church does play a role, and that's simply because of the prevalence of DV in our community, the fact that DV is theologically repugnant, it causes significant spiritual, emotional and physical harm, and is present and seriously present within the church. So this means whether you think the church should play a role or not, your attitudes and responses really do matter. So some suggestions would be to know your own personal theology, but also to know your limits. No one's beliefs are completely context-free. Be careful with language and word pictures, training staff and pastoral and ministry workers in DV disclosure first aid, preach on the topic, host a seminar for interested members of the congregation. I've obviously indicated there that, you know, this is something I'm willing to be involved in, although I'm sure there are much better equipped people out there to do it. And what I've put here is a bit of a summary of what some churches are doing Australia-wide. There are a number of sermons that I've identified there. If you're looking for a sermon or a podcast or something on this issue, there's some options there that you can click on. There are some statements provided by churches, including Baptist Care Australia, that might just inform your thinking or raise some other issues that you might like to ask questions about down the track. Check your church policies and employment contracts are all in order. Your staff may or may not be entitled to domestic and family violence leave. It's something to check. And my encouragement would be to develop a church culture that says violence is never acceptable in our homes and our churches, and sin thrives in silence. I want to particularly draw your attention to this resource. It's called Safer Resource, and you can find it at saferresource.org.au. It is an excellent, excellent one-stop shop, if you like, for churches to help them understand, identify and respond to domestic and family violence. It's a product of, it's come out of the Common Grace movement, which is a non-denominational social action group out of Sydney, I think. That's the web address there. In particular, because this is a seminar on resources, I've drawn your attention to their resources page, and you'll see that they have a whole range of things about domestic violence: church ministry resources, Bible studies, recorded sermons, sermon outlines, prayer resources. They've got their own referral list, which can be very helpful. DV alert training. So there's a whole lot of stuff there. And if you go nowhere else or do any other thinking around any of this, I'd encourage you to visit their website. It's comprehensive, it's well researched, and to my way of thinking, very Christian. A couple of other references and acknowledgements there. And I think we've got a few minutes for questions. So if you'd like to just type them in your chat box there, I'll answer them as they come in.